So we are excited to virtually convene today for a panel discussion on misinformation and disinformation, factors and solutions for media and tech, plus a lot more. And I wanted to start by introducing myself. I'm Aubrey Hayes. I'm the Director of Membership at the NYC Media Lab. And just a brief intro for those who don't know who we are. We are housed at NYU Tannen School of Engineering, and we are basically dedicated to driving innovation and job growth in media and tech by fostering collaborations with NYU, as well as other New York City universities and our member industry companies here at the Media Lab. And our goal to amplify media innovation, build pipelines, create awesome conversations between companies and academia and just the community at large. So today we are going to delve into it and explore some trends in disinformation and information and misinformation, and how tech tools can help analyze and combat some of the challenges we are currently facing. We are joined by my counterpart and our moderator, Matt McVeigh, who is the community and project lead for AI Local News. And our panelists today are Laura Edelson, who is at the NYU Ad Observatory. She's going to speak to that. And then we have Rachel Greenstadt, who is an associate professor of computer science at NYU Tannen, and so much more. And then we have David Klepper, who is our misinformation reporter from the Associated Press. And we're going to add a couple links in the chat if you would like to look them up in real time right now, as well as a follow-up afterwards. And Matt, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and we'll just jump right into it.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good morning. At least we're in the morning here on the East Coast. And thank you all for joining us. I'm Matt McVeigh. Going to give brief intros for our panelists, and then we'll get into discussion. We're going to look at current trends, the tools used to monitor and combat misinfo and disinfo, some of the job pathways, and what's coming next. And then we will open up for questions at the end, and we invite you all to use the chat to pose your questions, and we'll kind of pull things from there. So first off is David Klepper, who works for the Associated Press, where he covers the technology, misinformation, and extremism. And his recent work has focused on the role that misinformation plays in elections in the United States and abroad, the COVID-19 pandemic, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So welcome, David. Laura Edelson is a postdoctoral researcher with cybersecurity for democracy at NYU's Tannen School of Engineering, where she helped to develop Ad Observatory, which we'll hear more about today. Prior to her current time in academia, Laura was a software engineer for Palantir and FactSet, where she focused on applied machine learning and big data. Rachel Greenstadt is an associate professor of computer science at NYU Tannen and a member of the NYU Center for Cybersecurity. She holds a U.S. Department of Homeland Security Fellowship, earned a PET Award for Outstanding Research in Privacy-Enhancing Technologies, and a National Science Foundation Career Award. And she's also a member of the DARPA Computer Science Study Group. So yeah, keep the chat going, and we'll pull questions from there at the end, and let's dive into things. Before I ask for kind of a couple of quick highlights from what you all have been working on recently, I just want to set the stage with a quick bit of context, and I'm wondering, maybe Laura, if you can handle this, just as far as the distinction between misinformation and disinformation. Two things we'll be talking about a lot today, but I just want to start by making sure we're sort of have a clear idea of maybe the subtlety between the two there.
Yeah, so the difference between mis and disinformation really comes down to intent. I know that in my work, because my work is so focused on like the final mile of mis and disinformation, practically speaking, we typically refer to just about everything as misinformation, because disinformation is always misinformation, but not all misinformation is disinformation, because disinformation requires that the person who's creating it has intent to deceive and knows what they're doing. And typically in that final mile, we don't have enough information about the author to really know that they know what they're doing is false. I'd say that understanding that distinction maybe gets a little closer to Rachel's work about being able to identify authors, and when we're talking about, for example, a foreign state actor, then we can start to say, okay, they know what they're doing, but that's where the line is.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to give you all a quick moment to maybe highlight some of the recent work that you've all done, just to kind of give some context to everyone, and then we'll dive into trends. So David, do you want to get started?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me in this very important conversation. I'm delighted to be here with you all today. As discussed, I am the AP's misinformation reporter. I was the first reporter hired with that title. I used to be a political reporter who covered New York State government and politics, and 3 years ago became the misinformation reporter. Since then, I have written quite a bit about elections, both in the US and foreign elections, as well as the COVID pandemic. Most recently, I would say our work has focused on the US midterms, elections in France and Brazil, and really since the election, almost all of our work has been focused on Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter, which has really changed that platform and highlighted a lot of the larger challenges in terms of social media moderation.
Great. Thank you. Rachel, do you want to give us some quick highlights?
Yeah, so I'm a researcher who comes kind of out of the privacy and cybersecurity kind of space, and that's kind of the perspective I take on these things. I'm probably most well known for my work on, that Laura alluded to, on attribution of text and code. We've recently sort of applied that to trying to understand kind of what the workflow was of some of the sort of online accounts that were used for the 2016 misinformation campaigns, as well as the Reddit Wall Street Bets sort of short squeeze to understand sock puppets and things like that. It's also made me very interested in understanding the value of anonymity in online communication. We've done some work on trying to understand the role of anonymity in Wikipedia contributions, and some work on trying to understand manipulation of content curation algorithms through Instagram pods, and trying to understand sort of differential advertising that happens on conspiracy theory videos on YouTube. So a variety of different elements like that.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Laura, do you want to wrap us up?
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for putting this panel together. I'm already having a good time talking to Rachel and David.
Great.
A lot of my work is focused on understanding the relative spread and prevalence of harmful content in large online networks, with a goal of hopefully moving toward understanding not just why there is so much, but maybe how to decrease it. And my dog is having a good time in the background. Apologies for that. But most of my work has focused on Facebook, and in particular trying to understand the ad space, trying to understand the overall prevalence of particularly mis and disinformation, but to a lesser extent other forms of political polarizing content in that ad space, and moving into the organic space as well. Great.
And let's start with kind of the current moment and what we've seen, particularly over the United States midterm elections. I'm kind of curious to hear maybe from David or Laura what, I feel like this is always a big kind of stress test or a good case study for what some of the trends are with misinformation. So are there particular things that stood out to you all with what you've seen on the various social platforms in the last few months?
I can certainly jump in and talk about what the AP saw in the last several months. I would say the first takeaway is that 2020 never ended. Many of the claims we saw this year were in some cases literally the same claims recycled a few years later. Many of the same themes and narratives we saw in 2016, in 2018, in 2020 continued again. Almost all of the misinformation that got significant traction about the election had to do with voting itself. That was another very, I think, important observation. This is no longer, we often see misinformation about hot button issues like immigration, law enforcement. This year, a lot of it focused on the act and mechanics of voting itself, which a lot of the experts I talked to said is particularly dangerous because it calls into question trust in our very system of government itself. So that was something we certainly saw. I would say two other things quickly. One, overall, I think we did not see the level and the impact from misinformation that many were concerned we would see. We saw a lot of it. A lot of voters saw a lot of it. But the impact is a little bit, of course, it's very difficult. I rely on smarter people like my co-panelists to determine the actual impact. But we saw things like incitement to violence. We saw the former president, Donald Trump, ask his supporters to descend on polling places aggressively. That did not happen. And so the impact of this misinformation in the midterms doesn't seem to be quite what some of its architects had hoped. Finally, I think we saw a lot of good government and election officials and media do a much better job this year of prebunking the disinformation and misinformation by putting out explainers, by issuing press releases saying we know the vote tally will be late. That's not unusual. That's not a reason for concern. Here's how the vote is counted, things like that, which I do think really helped sort of preempt a lot of the impact that misinformation could have had.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think we saw a lot of the kind of diffuse claims around, around specific counties, specific election officials. Sometimes even, there's specific polling places where there'd be some kind of misinformation claim about that specific thing, which certainly presents a problem for those of us who try to track and keep track of this, because it's almost easy. It's easier just to track one big diffuse claim. Now, a lot of these are tapping into the same broad theme, but then they get like specialized. And I think something else that was also a repeated, a repeated pattern from 2016 is where there are disinformation claims that are being put out in the broader media that then get hyper amplified online. So, if we think about a piece of media that was just disinformation, 2,000 mules, right? That is a piece of disinformation, and it fed and amplified a lot of these claims online. There are others as well. I think that the other thread that I saw that I would want to pull on is, we really saw really ramped up claims around social issues that we wouldn't quite call that are difficult to call mis and disinformation because they lacked a specific claim around trans people, and very specifically like drag shows or events featuring drag performers. Those claims were ramping up all through the summer of, things like content that really explicitly othered, and I would say went so far as to promote hate. And it really ramped up right until the election. It was quite disturbing, but that gets to one of the things that's definitionally hard to talk about because it typically lacked a specific claim. And it was often very diffuse, rather than saying this one specific drag performer is groomer or whatever. It sort of made these broad statements and claims that are hard to, without a fact, it's hard to say, okay, this has a false claim, and that makes, and then something else that makes our job harder.
Yeah. I want to ask a quick kind of follow up on that. Like it, from what David said, with things like talking about the actual voting process or when results come out, sounds like there's been an improvement in, people knowing that might be an issue, going ahead with pre-bunking that kind of helps, maybe combat that a little bit. With this example of people talking about drag shows and things like that, how do you go about kind of identifying and sort of tracking a little bit, okay, this is sort of a new theme that's, that people seem to be focusing on. How do you kind of monitor that and note, maybe this is something new that there does need to be a little more awareness built around, and sort of finding those new, I don't know if you would call it an information vacuum or what, but things like that.
We absolutely use that term, information vacuum. David, I mean, we have a very almost, mechanical process. I'm curious how you tackle it from a more like editorial perspective. Okay.
There are groups, the Center for Countering Digital Hate. There are various groups that track this stuff, hate speech and extremism online, and I rely on these people. They've gotten very good at searching for terms. This is something that's come up with Twitter quite a bit, searching for racial epithets on Twitter. The use has skyrocketed as basically as people try and test the new boundaries on Twitter. But this is and this, I think Laura brings up a great question. Is this misinformation, or is this, political opinion? Is it hate speech? And trying to figure out exactly what you're dealing with, I think, is critical, and using the right terms is critical. Clearly, this is hate speech, and clearly this is an effort to demonize and other a large segment of Americans. And so I think it has to be taken very seriously. And I'm glad to see a lot of the researchers that had focused on misinformation getting into hate speech and hate rhetoric in general, because I think it's a critical problem that needs a lot more study.
Oh, one thing, you've reminded me of something else that I can't believe we have to talk about, but we do, which is anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Anti-Semitism is back. I mean, just crazy. So for us, because we take this very whole ecosystem approach, we literally we build topic classifiers so we can identify, for all of the content that we observe, how much of it falls into these different topic categories. And so we always have this unclassified topic where sometimes it really doesn't fall into any topic we care about, and that's fine. But we always keep an eye on, what are we not classifying as something else, to look for new trends, things that might emerge to that maybe start to need to become their own topic. And that actually gets a little bit difficult with the stuff that truly is hate speech, because very often it's so small that our general approach is like, how do we understand the entire spectrum of content going on? And some of these things are extremely niche, and building a process where you can both talk about the haystack and also identify needles in the haystack is they're kind of slightly separate problems. And something something that touches on some comments in the chat, there's some things that like there's no continuum on. There really isn't that much of a continuum. I'm not saying there's no continuum, but there's like much less of a continuum of rhetoric about anti-Semitism. There's like dog whistles, and then there's explicit anti-Semitism, but there's very little like nuanced critique, I guess. But there, I would say that the trans stuff does sometimes fall more in a spectrum where there is a relationship between an ad that is there's like a Supreme Court case going on right now about like how someone doesn't want to make wedding websites for like gay or trans people. I think very few people would classify a news article about that content as hate speech. I think that I certainly, and many other people, would classify an ad that says all trans people are groomers as hate speech. But there's, so for us, that's something where we have to figure out where is the boundary between where that boundary is, and figure out how to draw it.
And when you're, as far as kind of like trying to identify or track different things, then what are some of the approaches that you use to kind of, I guess, flag different types of content or follow different threads in different ways as you go about kind of labeling those things?
So for us, and I'm curious, again, this starts to get into how do you editorialize that David might have opinions on, and how do you apply technical methods that Rachel might have opinions on. For us, we tend to take a kind of hybrid approach where we define topics. We work with political scientists at NYU to understand the politics part of this and the social issues part of this, but then we apply typically machine learning methods to be able to implement that human-driven knowledge in an intelligent way. So so for us, we when we tried not having that human piece, we wound up with things that like weren't very useful. So we think we typically, if we want to say things that are actually describe information in a way that is important to people, we need to start with that lens of knowledge of what is important. But then we think the most effective way to implement that is with automated tools.
Great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Rachel, I'm curious, in your work, maybe with some of your recent research about pods, sort of how you've gone about tracking some of the different methods that people use to amplify their messages on some of these social platforms. So maybe if you could talk about sort of what pods are and sort of your approach to studying that.
Okay, so in that work, we were looking at Instagram pods, which is, so basically you have an Instagram account, you want to have engagement and have your Instagram content go viral, get a bunch of followers. There are a variety of ways to sort of amplify this. The most common way that people know is using like bots and things, but there are also these tools called pods, where you join them and you sort of post your post to the pod, and then some of them are like pods, which means that like other people in the pod will like your comment, or some of them are comment pods or like and comment pods. They have various different rules. So we knew about a couple of these through Telegram. So we joined a couple of Telegram channels that were pods, and we monitored the pod posts, and then we sort of collected a set of Instagram posts and tried to collect a set of comparison and posts to kind of compare the differences between the pods, the posts that were known to be part of pods and the posts that were not known to be part of pods. We also just, we kind of did sort of we drew on a combination of previous research and sort of a snowballing of looking at these channels. To some of them will lead you to other channels and various things, and got sort of, I think, probably not the whole space. There are some pods that are sort of smaller and niche or require you to have a certain threshold of followers, and we couldn't necessarily monitor those, but we could monitor the ones that were largely open to most people. And so that was one of the ways to do that. I think in general, you have to look at kind of, there's this work is sort of inherently interdisciplinary. And I think you have to look at a combination of like what people have learned from social scientists, sort of what kind of empirical data is out there that you can kind of collect and corroborate. And I think using mixed methods that involve sort of some automation and machine learning and some, qualitative methods, just close readings, interviews, et cetera, things like that can give you sort of a fuller picture of where to start with some of this stuff. We're very, for the conspiracy theory work, we're very fortunate to have like other researchers that have done some channel curation that we could start with that to build our research on top of.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm sure it's a bit of a cat and mouse game, and you all can tell me how much that's the case, but like in general, as far as our ability to sort of track and understand some of the different methods that people might be using to amplify their messages or to spread disinformation and misinformation, do you feel like we're getting to a place where we're better able to track and study those things, or is it something where it's just a constant evolution and you're always having to kind of catch up with whatever the newest method or trend is, or where would you say we're kind of at this point?
I mean, both of those things can be true.
Mhm.
I do think that dealing with mis and disinformation, like dealing with a lot of these, I don't know, maybe hybrid threats. For example, spam is an ever evolving problem to solve, but it is one that we have made steady progress on, and that we can't, like, it is not solved. It will never be perfectly solved, but we know how to mitigate it to a point where it doesn't bother, it doesn't make email unusable. We sort of can keep it to an acceptable level. I think that's kind of where we are going with many kinds of harmful content on social media, for a lot of similar reasons. Like, we are starting to understand, because of Rachel's work, we are starting to understand how to identify actors more accurately and faster. A lot of my work is, we're making progress on understanding the prevalence of harmful content online. And where my work is sort of going next is trying to understand how the acceleration is working. And if we can get that part, that's going to really help. So I think we need to get a better understanding of the problem, then we need to start testing mitigations, but I at least feel like we're making progress. Rachel, what do you think?
Yeah, I do think it's a both and. I think we are in the midst of a sort of a change in our information ecosystem that's probably, comparable to the development of the printing press. And, while we think of that as generally the printing press is a good thing, we tend to gloss over the 100 years or so of like bloody war that followed, right, and disruption. And I think that, we are at a time where we're starting to get some tools to understand these things and understand the value of transparency. And I think as people become a bit more savvy about individual information consumption, hopefully, norms and trends, but things do continue to change. So it's also a challenge. But I think that, David talked about prebunking, and I think there's a lot to, and Laura talked about spam. I think there's a lot to learn from that history there, and some of the research that's been done in the cybersecurity community on sort of scams and phishing, and sort of, and the value that, people, when people know about these things ahead of time, they do tend to fall for them less. And I think this similar things are true in these online, ecosystems, but kind of understanding, where an individual sort of fact-checked content, isn't probably enough in the context of sort of siloed communities that sort of, and where people are getting their trust anchors, and if those trust anchors are sort of compromised in some way. So yeah.
I think what Rachel was very politely saying was that at one point in journalism, we tried to deal with misinformation by doing fact checks and assuming that everyone would read the fact check and everyone would be convinced by it. What we have found is that people who didn't believe us to begin with wouldn't believe the fact check. And so I think one of the things I've noticed in the last 5 years is that we've gotten a lot better and a lot more sophisticated in how we approach it. There are still the fact checks, but there's also the prebunking, and there's also more explainers, and there's also way better research as showing the scope of the problem. So I would agree. When I got into this beat, I found it very pessimistic and very disturbing how the problem seemed to have no solution. But I think we've gotten a lot smarter thanks to people like my co-panelists who have studied this stuff. And I think the solutions are now there.
Excellent. And I'm wondering if you all have anything to sort of more to add about that, as far as, are we starting to see, especially from, well, kind of from any perspective, but particular tools or interventions that seem to be the most effective as far as maybe combating some of this misinformation, whether, if it's flagging content or fact checking, which maybe seem like the results are a little iffier, or if it's things like prebunking or kind of counter messaging, if there's anything that kind of seems to be most effective at this point.
Prebunking. By miles, prebunking. I would say this is something that this is a lot of why I've been interested in and trying to follow the information war that is happening, that is still happening, is not over in the Ukraine theater, because it's absolutely fascinating to observe, honestly, nation states that are doing on the ground conventional war and are also engaged in this information war. I think particularly early on in that conflict, we saw how effective prebunking was. And I know that for me, that was absolutely one of the things that has made me really start to feel much more hopeful about this problem, because I can say, like, look, I feel like I'm making progress in the research that we're doing, but it was really heartening to see very early in that conflict, the US government, and like very specifically the Biden White House, was very aggressive at messaging what we knew about Russia's intents and their activities on the ground, and that worked. Like, that actually had a very positive impact on Russia's or protective effect on Russia's ability to deceive people, particularly in Eastern Europe. It was really interesting to see something work in practice. That was very cool. And we've continued to see that in that conflict. Occasionally, we have seen either the Ukraine government or occasionally other European governments come out and talk about, we think that Russia is going to be saying this or coming out with this, and they've been effective at that prebunking thing has been really effective in practice. I don't know, what David and Rachel, what do you think?
I guess I totally agree with the prebunking. It hasn't been, my particular area of research in a huge amount, but I've seen it in other research in a lot of different areas, like, again, as diverse as, from nation state wars to like telephone scams, right? It's pretty effective. I think, and we were getting at this just before the call started, I'm going to kind of tilt more toward my areas of expertise of looking at identity. And I think there's an instinct that people have to think that, like, well, if we just knew who everyone was and they couldn't, lie about it, then we'd be fine. And I think that conflates some things. It's not necessarily necessary, I think, online to know who everyone is. And sometimes it's harmful for all of these harassment and hate issues. But I think it's more important to know kind of who they're not, and not allow people to misrepresent things. I think, Laura, in some of your research on like sort of political ads that have sort of misrepresented their labels and things like that, you see that as well. This value of trying to kind of convince people that you are coming from some trustworthy source and And that's also sort of a thing that we saw in this sort of the change of affordances in Twitter Blue that happened. So I think that trying to understand, necessarily where things are coming from and where they're not, and knowing which, that aspect is also somewhat important. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people can't, communicate online effectively and meaningfully and civilly as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
David, do you want to say a little bit? I know that sort of Twitter is kind of a different thing every,
Yes.
few hours, or at least it seems that way to me. But just kind of about what some of those changes were with sort of Twitter Blue and verification on that platform recently.
I think that is, and somebody said this, that it's a perfect encapsulation of sort of the confusion that often reigns when it comes to online misinformation. And it's a great example of how Twitter has sort of descended into inconsistency and confusion since the new ownership. No one really knows what's going on Twitter. They said they would no longer enforce their COVID misinformation policy, which required them to label and remove harmful misinformation about vaccines and things like that. Then they said just a few days later, actually, nothing has changed. They have allowed back on a lot of people who'd been suspended for hate speech or violating another policy. And Musk has signaled that he wants to allow any speech that is legally permitted in the country of the user, a threshold which varies dramatically from country to country, of course. And yet one of his first notable acts was to deplatform the rapper known as Kanye West for posting anti-Semitic content, which is legal. So it's very confusing, I think, for many users to understand exactly what the rules are and what the direction of that platform is. And it is, Twitter, I think, is a great example. Many people in the world are not on Twitter, but Twitter has a profound influence in global discourse. And so I think it shows. Yoel Roth, the former head of trust and safety at Twitter, recently said that one of the reasons he left was all of the legacy that Twitter had built about rules and transparency was being eroded. And I think this does show the importance of having clear, transparent, consistent rules that users can understand and that are enforced across the board. So we're kind of living through a real world experiment with Twitter, and I don't think anybody knows exactly what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And thinking back to sort of the aspect of an individual account, are there best practices, especially from kind of a tech point of view, as far as being able to maybe verify an identity or kind of identify when an account is trustworthy?
There are, but yeah, Rachel, I think you've done the most research on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the way that Twitter used to do it, largely, out of band for high profile, I mean, there's two aspects of this, right? Like, there's the first is like, is this account consistently like the same person it's been, right? And this is the context of, people have long used sort of account age as a proxy for trustworthiness because, you build up a reputation over time, and maybe it doesn't necessarily matter, again, who that person actually is, and then from that perspective, it's sort of a straightforward but still difficult cybersecurity problem of like making sure that the person who's logging into the account is the same person over, and you can use things like two-factor authentication and so on to help with that. The second piece of it is like making sure that I can't pretend to be President Biden, right? And online, and that involves maybe doing that for accounts that are sort of well known. That's been sort of an out of band thing where somebody does some verification of that. It's the same thing to some extent of extended verification certificates for web for websites and things like that. Somebody validates it, and there's, and then there's sort of encryption that is used to, or authentication that is used to maintain the integrity over time, rather. So I think that's kind of the piece for that. Some of my research is around kind of using things like linguistic style to identify that these two accounts are the same person, or verify that it is. And this works. It's with, with some fuzziness, right? Like it's not 100%, but it can help us to understand, for example, that there's probably there were more people creating fake accounts in the Wall Street Bets subreddit than in the funny Reddit or the gaming Reddit subreddit, right? When the short squeeze was going on. So things like that.
I think what this kind of comes down to is that so many of these terms are so overloaded. And I know we were talking about this before the panel got started, but something I've just always not as a computer scientist, but as a person, I always struggle when someone asks me well, do you trust that? Do you trust that person? And I always think well, trust them to do what? I trust my 5-year-old to be my 5-year-old. And I trust my bank to be my bank. And it's not that I don't trust my 5-year-old, it's that I know my 5-year-old and I have certain expectations for my 5-year-old. And I also don't expect my bank to give me a hug when I walk in the door, and I'm very comfortable with that. I mean, I think something that a lot of people are trying to solve is this trust problem. But what they mean is, when I am interacting with an account, I want to have some guarantees about what this other account is that I can use to base my perceptions of what this account is telling me. I think that and this doesn't have to be a one size fits all, right? A lot of people who talk about real identities being the solution to the trust problem, really have no answer for the fact that, well, what about people who really aren't safe talking about something online in their own voice, right? That is a very real problem for many people in many countries of this, on this planet. And those people shouldn't be, we wouldn't want those people excluded from online spaces because they can't speak as themselves safely. But I think it is worth knowing, is the identity of the person I'm speaking to, has that been verified offline, right? That is a reasonable thing for someone to be able to look at an account and know, okay, I'm talking to the real David Klepper. I'm gonna think about the information that comes from this account differently if it's been verified to be a reporter at the Associated Press, because all of those identities bring a certain frame for how I'm gonna interpret what this person is saying. And that's not to say that there shouldn't be anonymous accounts, but I think it is reasonable to allow people to know, am I interacting with an account that's verified its identity and the identity is this or not? And similarly, it's absolutely reasonable, and we all get benefit from automated accounts on Twitter. One that I think we can all talk about as being a great and important automated account, although I'm not sure if it's still active, is Kevin Roos's top 10 on Facebook account. It's a Twitter, it's a Twitter bot, or at least it used to be, that would post automatically to Twitter the top 10 things that were trending on CrowdTangle. That was a great automated account that was very transparent about the fact that it was an automated account. And this is very different from an automated account that is, again, not transparent about the fact that it's a bot. So I think that's where I think we need to be really crisp and specific about what we mean by trust, and allow it to mean different things, or allow us to be able to trust people to be different and to be telling us different things.
I will throw in one anecdote about bots. This is such a growing field, the field we're talking about today, that there are a lot of new companies and new groups doing great work. And they will often pitch me their research, and not all research is created equal. And it is not uncommon for startups to claim they've identified bots and automated accounts, and they'll send them over. And this is proof that whatever we're talking about is a fake conversation. Bots are leading the conversation. we will look at the bot account in question, and almost invariably, there's one of them that we'll find is actually a real person. This happened a month ago, and a group, actually an Israeli company that studies this stuff, had said, we found some bots. And the first one I looked at was actually a retired lady living in Pittsburgh. So, this research is tough. And so you just got to be careful, because I think that it is tricky to figure out authenticity online, and it's not foolproof.
That's great. That's great. There's so much to dig into here, which is really exciting. I want to open it up to Q&A for the last few minutes. Maybe I'll ask one really quick question first of you all, just because I want to make sure we don't skip it. And actually, I think this even lines up with some of the questions from you all as well. But thinking, David, I'm curious to hear about sort of, who's on the misinfo team at AP, and for Rachel and Laura, I'm curious about, as far as thinking about careers in kind of studying misinformation, if there's, particular directions, as far as getting started with that, or particular angles that people might want to kind of look at if they want to dive into this more.
I can go first, and I'll be fast. First of all, for those who don't know, the AP, we're like 170 years old. We're in every state, 100 countries. We churn out, I think, 2,000 stories a day. We're generally considered to be the largest news organization in the world. And like other large news organizations, we have sort of newly gotten into the world of misinformation, even though, as we all like to say, every reporter covers misinformation. Every reporter who holds a government official accountable for their misstatements covers misinformation. But we have a small team. I report to the Washington Bureau in Washington, D.C., but I'm sort of tangentially involved in our tech team, which is in San Francisco. And we also have a stable of about 15 reporters who are on our news verification team, which is bilingual, English and Spanish. We are in the US and we are in Mexico, and they debunk dozens of online claims every week, the top claims that we see circulating online, and we have relationships with some of the tech companies to try and study that, and they just debunk these things over and over and over again. I'll put their website in there, but chances are, if you've seen something specious online, they have debunked it. And then I sort of write the more sort of long form stories. I see my goal as to try and explain this world to the busy public. So I try and sort of get the best data I can, and then step beyond that and tell the human story about how this is all impacting us. But I would say this is like a growth field in journalism. A lot of really good journalism is being done in this field, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot more, because I don't see this challenge going away.
Great. Laura or Rachel are there?
Sure. I'll start. So I'm in the cybersecurity center here at NYU. So is Laura's affiliated with that as well as CSE, the computer science and engineering department here. I think, this is increasingly an area that lots of people doing research in tech and working in tech companies have to deal with. Most of these big platforms all have trust and safety teams and things like that. My research is mostly, computer scientists, but we do collaborate with people doing digital ethnography, psychologists. It's a very interdisciplinary field with publication venues that vary quite a bit. At the IEEE Security and Privacy Conference coming up, I'm going to be helping to host a workshop on security for harassment, online protections, and empowerment. So that's, if you're interested in kind of the harassment side of that, that's a thing that's going to happen in May. But I think, people that are interested in cybersecurity and computer science, there's a lot of ways to get into this, but I think not neglecting the social science piece of it is important too. So have that interdisciplinary frame of mind. Laura, what do you think?
I think you should come be a computer scientist.
Yes.
You're absolutely right that this is an inherently interdisciplinary field. I work with a lot of political scientists and social scientists and lawyers and policy people in our policy work. But we desperately need more computer scientists working on this problem. We need more cybersecurity researchers working on this problem. And computer science is a great field to be in. So if you are thinking about, if you have a, I'll say this, I was a software engineer. I had an industry life and I gave it all up and went and got a PhD. And it was a great decision that I'm very, very happy I made. I have a lot of fun now. So I'd say if you want to, computer science PhDs are a lot of fun. So yeah, you should do that. That would be my advice to, to anyone who is interested.
Great. And with sort of that interdisciplinary idea in mind, one question that I've seen come up a couple of times is related to education, especially for maybe young people. Are you all seeing any opportunities there, or any sort of exciting things, around teaching young people about misinformation and sort of the effectiveness of that?
If we don't do that, we're in trouble.
Yeah.
I would say, in my prediction, in 20 years, there will be media literacy, critical thinking skills taught in kindergarten, because I think that's probably necessary.
Yeah, I do think that this gets into the tech literacy and media literacy piece that unfortunately some of the early research on media literacy is not as strong as we would like it to be. But I think this gets back to some of the things that folks were saying earlier about how the printing press dramatically changed society. We just have to think about how, and if you look at what radio did to this country, in the last century, I think we all as a society need to learn how to live with these modes of communication and learn how to think about information we receive via these channels. And it's just not the same as it has, as understanding how to receive media has been historically. So I do think that's going to be an important part of how we adjust.
Yeah. I have a student right now that's really interested in looking at kind of the privacy and security implications of online learning during the pandemic and the ways in which, kids in K through 8 are kind of anchored in how you interact with devices and how you treat information that shows up on that screen. I think is important to understand, and the ways in which people think about these issues of trust is something to think through. I've worked with K through 12 teachers sometimes to try, and I'm not an expert at all on how to translate the work that I do to age appropriate type things, but I think working with people who are as a way to say, here's what I do, and maybe we can work together and you can come up with lessons to help bring things into your classroom. I think we've got to do some more of that, and hopefully eventually we'll hit up on something and learn how to make better sense of things.
Yeah. So there's a couple of questions about, and maybe this will be the last thing that we dive into before we wrap up, but about kind of paths of study. Either one is sort of, I think, within kind of the world of computer science, and I know that it sounds like there's many paths in, but if you could kind of maybe highlight some of those. And then another question, if anyone wants to sort of tack on something about this, is actually if there are kind of paths within the legal and law sort of study that that kind of line up with this. So if there's maybe any particular types of backgrounds and some of the people coming kind of from the legal world that you all have interacted with in your work that come to mind, maybe to highlight those too.
I mean,
Well-
the first, sorry, Rachel, you go.
Oh, I was just saying, well, I mean, I've definitely throughout my work interacted a lot with folks at the Federal Trade Commission and the EFF, both of which have a nice setup where they have, you know, lawyers working closely with technologists to kind of understand and address, you know, these and related problems in various ways that I think, you know, is pretty good. So I would say that if you're in law trying to connect up with organizations like that might be helpful. Laura, what you were going to say?
Absolutely, those two. And I'd say another two I might throw out there would be the ACLU and the Knight First Amendment Institute are other groups of folks that think about these issues definitely through a specific lens of free speech, but that is a very complicated thing to get right. And those are folks who are really thinking about what that means in a digital landscape. And
I should probably plug that we do have folks at the NYU Law School that are affiliated with our Center for Cybersecurity here as well.
Yes, absolutely.
So.
Our Cybersecurity Center is explicitly interdisciplinary, and that's the one law class I've ever taken was our cybersecurity law class, which was very informative.
Very cool. Very cool.
I don't think we have time to talk about Section 230, and so I won't.
Thank
But
God.
I think the future of this, I mean, lawyers are going to be heavily involved in the future and in writing the rules and regulations that cover these platforms. Europe, I think, is a little bit ahead of us in terms of their Digital Services Act and how that's going to play out. But I think there will be plenty of jobs for lawyers looking at this world soon. I would also say that I think this touches everybody now. You know, whether you're a small business, I mean, you could be the subject of disinformation and it could be catastrophic to your business if you are. So I think anybody that, you know, any realm of life is going to be connected to this.
Fake reviews.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you, David, Laura, and Rachel so much for this wonderful conversation and sort of diving into all aspects of research and what's going on here. And there's so much more we can talk about. So I hope you encourage all of you all attending to kind of follow up with David and Laura and Rachel's work. Thank you all so much. And I will turn it over to Aubrey to wrap things up.
Yes, just to mirror what Matt just said, we really appreciate all your time and everybody who logged in to interact and answer some wonderful questions. If we can, maybe we'll do a follow-up if we have time to maybe answer some of these other questions offline, as well as we'll send everybody all the important links and everything that we kind of talked about that just was like, you know, sort of a fever rush in the chat. So we'll get to all that. And just to put on people's radar too, we do have another event coming up that Matt is doing on December 13th, a remote discussion at 12:30 p.m. AI and local news community talk on Applied XL. And we would love for you to join. We will also in our follow-up send a link to that if anybody would like to tune in. And yeah, we just appreciate all of you for this never-ending conversation that we could probably spend like a whole semester on. And to be continued. Maybe we'll do a follow-up at some point. Who knows? And we can
No,
see
we'll have
where
it solved by then.
Oh, of course.
Completely.
Yeah.
I mean, in a half glass full, of course. But yes, but I do feel like that. Yeah, this is a continuum, and we're very fortunate to have all of you people in the space advocating for the rodeo that the world is right now. So thank you for the Media Lab, and yeah, till next time, everybody.